Hello, everyone. So my name is Zohir Chaudhary, and uh, today we will explain the current WHO classification of pandemic phases and possible actions that are suggested to be taken by countries. And do remember that WHO is the only authority who can designate global pandemics. So influenza pandemics are unpredictable, but they are recurring events that can have severe consequences on societies and on societies worldwide. Since the 16th century, influenza pandemics have been described at intervals ranging between 10 and 50 years, with varying severity and impact, and major ones occurring every 10 years or so every 100 years or so. In this table, you can see the impact from the Spanish flu and the Hong Kong flu, and the Asian flu, which were all pandemics in the 20th century, as described in here. Because of this increased risk of recurring influenza virus based on pandemics, the WHO pandemic phases were developed in 1999 and revised in 2005 and are currently used as main guidelines for WHO. The phases are applicable to the entire world and provide a global framework to aid countries in pandemic preparedness and response planning. WHO uses a six-phased approach for easy incorporation of new recommendations and approaches into existing national preparedness and response plans. So the phases 1 and 3 correlate with preparedness, including capacity development and response planning activities, while phases 4, 5, and 6 clearly signal the need for response and mitigation efforts. Furthermore, periods after the first pandemic waves are elaborated to facilitate post-pandemic recovery activities. Each of these WHO phases applies worldwide once announced. However, individual countries will be affected at different times. In addition to the globally announced pandemic, phases that WHO will announce. So countries may want to make further national distinctions based upon their specific situations. For example, countries may wish to consider whether the potential pandemic virus is causing disease within their own borders, in neighboring countries, or countries in close proximity, and based on that understanding, take proper action. This table describes the most recent WHO classification of pandemic stages, phases 1 to phases 6, and then a post peak period and post pandemic period also are incorporated. We'll go into more details in subsequent slides and learn more about each of these phases. In here, we are narrowing down to the stages or phases from 1 to 6. Stages 1 and 2 are known as interpandemic period. The risk is relatively low, but the risk increases in stage or phase 2, and the goal is to prepare and minimize risk. Stages 3 to 5 are known as pandemic alert period, with evidence to increased human-to-human transmission. The goal is to focus on containing or delaying the spread. And finally, phase 6 is the pandemic period where sustained human-to-human transmission is occurring. The goal is to minimize impact. So phases 1 to 3 are detailed in here. And we know that in nature, influenza viruses circulates continuously among animals, especially in birds. And even though such viruses might theoretically develop into pandemic viruses, in phase one, no viruses circulating among animals have been reported to cause infections in humans. However, the viruses have been recognized, and as a result, it poses low risk. In phase two, an animal influenza virus circulating among domesticated or wild animals is known to have caused infection in humans and is therefore considered a potential pandemic threat. Whereas in phase three, an animal or human animal influenza reassortant virus has caused sporadic cases or small clusters of diseases in people, but has not resulted in human to human transmission sufficient to sustain community level outbreaks. So limited human to human transmission may occur under some circumstances, for example, when there is close contact between an infected person and an unprotected caregiver. However, limited transmission under such restricted circumstances does not indicate that the virus has gained the level of transmissibility among humans necessary to cause a pandemic. So, main actions that can be taken during phases 1 to 3 are aimed at strengthening pandemic preparedness and response capacities at global, regional, national, and subnational level. For example, some of the action would be develop, exercise, and periodically revise national influenza pandemic preparedness and response plans, develop robust national surveillance systems in collaboration with national animal health authorities and other relevant sectors, complete communications planning and initiate communications activity to communicate real and potential risk, promote beneficial behaviors in individuals for self-protection, plan for use of pharmaceuticals and vaccine as well, and then prepare the health system to scale up for a potential phase four. In phases 4 and to 6, these are characterized by increased human to human transmission, especially in phase four, the human to human transmission of an animal or human animal influenza via certain virus is able to cause community level outbreaks. The ability to cause sustained disease outbreaks in a community marks a significant upward shift in the risk of a pandemic. Any country that suspects or has verified such an event should urgently consult with WHO so that the situation can be jointly assessed and a decision made by the affected country if implementation of a rapid pandemic containment operation is warranted. Phase 4 indicates a significant increase in risk of a pandemic, but does not necessarily mean that a pandemic is a foregone conclusion. Phase 5 is characterized by human to human spread of the virus into at least 2 countries in one WHO region. While most countries will not be affected at this stage, the declaration of phase 5 is a strong signal that a pandemic is imminent, and that the time to finalize the organization, communication, and the implementation of the planned mitigation measures is really, really short. Phase 6, the pandemic is the pandemic phase, and this is characterized by community level outbreaks in at least one other country in a different WHO region, in addition to the criteria defined in phase 5. Designation of this phase will indicate that a global pandemic is underway. The main action during these phases are described in here. And the overarching goal of actions taken during phase 4 is containment of the new virus within a limited area or the delay of its spread. If successful, valuable time could be gained to implement interventions, including the use of vaccines. During phases 5 and 6, actions shift from preparedness to response at a global level to reduce the impact. Some examples in phase 4 are detailed in here, the action example, and then actions for in phase 5 and 6 are shown in here. During the post-peak period, pandemic disease levels in most countries with adequate surveillance will have dropped below peak observed levels. The post-peak period signifies that pandemic activity appeared to be decreasing. However, it is uncertain if additional waves will occur, and countries will need to be prepared for a second wave. Previous pandemics have been characterized by waves of activity spread over months. Once the level of disease activity drops, a critical communications task will be able to balance this information with the possibility of another wave. Pandemic waves can be separated by months, and an immediate at each signal may be premature. In the post-pandemic period, influenza disease activity will have returned to levels normally seen for seasonal influenza. It is expected that the pandemic virus will behave as a seasonal influenza A virus. At this stage, it is important to maintain surveillance and update pandemic preparedness and response plans accordingly. An increased phase of recovery and evaluation may be required. The main action during post-peak and post-pandemic peaks are shown in here. In general, actions during the post-peak period focus on addressing the health and social impact of pandemic, as well as preparation for a possible future pandemic waves. The focus of the post-pandemic period is restoration of normal health, social functions, while addressing the long-term health and social impact of the pandemic. Similar to the WHO, the CDC in the United States has published the Pandemic Intervals Framework, which describes the progression of an influenza pandemic using 6 intervals: investigation, recognition, initiation, acceleration, deceleration, and preparation. In this figure, in the bottom, you can also see how this level corresponds to the WHO phases that we just discussed. In the investigation interval begins when cases of infection are identified in humans, whereas in the recognition interval, it is characterized by an increasing number of human cases of illness as they're identified. In the initiation of a pandemic phase in here, of course, when people are easily infected and the virus has the potential to spread from person to person, and it is slowly getting sustained from person to person. And then the acceleration or speeding up is the upward epidemiological curve as the new virus infects susceptible people. And then the deceleration or slowing down happens when pandemic influenza cases consistently decreases, and public health action include continued vaccination, monitoring of pandemic influenza circulation and illness, and so forth. And at the end is the preparation since the influenza subsided for subsequent waves. The pandemic severity index are depicted in here. So in addition to describing the progression of a pandemic, the CDC also has certain indicators and assessments tools are utilized to define when one interval moves into another. So CDC uses two tools, the Influenza Risk Assessment Tool and the Pandemic Severity Assessment Framework, to evaluate the pandemic risk that a new influenza A virus can pose. The results from both of these assessments are used to guide federal, state, and local public health decisions. That's all. Thank you.